Now, for more insight, we're joined by William Courtney, adjunct senior fellow at Rand Corporation. He's also a former U.S. ambassador to Georgia and Kazakhstan. Ambassador, let's start with the dam in the Russian-controlled area of southern Ukraine. Ukraine's military and NATO have accused Russia of blowing it up, while Russia has blamed Ukraine. What's your take, and what are the implications?
Well, the Ukrainians have no reason to have blown up the dam. A lot of Ukrainian citizens are going to have to relocate as a result of this act, and it would complicate to some extent any Ukrainian counteroffensive efforts that would require crossing the Dnipro River below the dam. The Russians, on the other hand, have mismanaged the dam. It has had high water levels recently, and there appears to have been some structural damage prior to the possible explosions that caused the breaches. So it is possible that the Russians, both by mismanagement and purposeful blowing up of the dam, have carried this act out.
Such a destruction of critical infrastructure is a tactic used in the conflict. Do you think it's also part of efforts to distract from Ukraine's counteroffensive? And at this point, is it likely to cause a humanitarian crisis?
It is causing a humanitarian crisis, but the Ukrainians seem to be reasonably well prepared to evacuate citizens. There are no reports of a significant number of deaths, for example. With regard to distraction, it is possible that Russia had in mind distraction, but my guess is that a more compelling reason was to try to impede crossing of the Dnipro River by Ukrainian forces.
And could you just elaborate on that? We know that Ukraine is currently undergoing its counteroffensive. I want to get your thoughts on that, and also what you make of sort of events happening or conflicts happening on Russia's side of the border, including drones in the capital of Moscow.
Well, with regard to the war itself, it is not clear where the main thrusts of the counteroffensives are going to be. There have been some probing attacks by Ukrainians, small scale in various places. The Russians are worried that the Ukrainians will try to come across the south to block the land bridge between Donbass and Crimea and get close enough to Crimea that Ukrainian forces can shell targets in Crimea, including Sevastopol, the naval base. So it is possible that the Russians have decided to flood the river there to make it harder for Ukrainian forces to cross below the dam. With regard to attacks in...
Please continue.
Sorry, go ahead. With regard to attacks in Moscow, those and several other attacks in Russia appear to be Ukrainian efforts to bring the war home to Russians, so to speak, to cause Russians to feel somewhat insecure. A lot of Russians, particularly in the wealthier cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, have not really felt much impact of the war so far. So the Ukrainians may be wanting to cause a little bit more fear in the Russian mindset.
Well, Ambassador, Ukraine is also reportedly investigating this incident as a potential case of ecocide, given the possibility of widespread damage to, the natural habitats. What sort of action can be taken against the party who has been deemed responsible for it, if at all?
Well, that would be something, in terms of legal action, would be something that would probably come after the war ends or after the active phase of fighting ends. There's some new legal ground that may be explored as a result of this war, including how one defines the impact of attacks on civilian critical infrastructure. So at this point, it's a little bit early to discuss what potential legal remedies might be sought.
But while the conflict rages on, President Zelensky has been pushing his allies for US-made F-16 fighter jets. How soon do you think he'll be able to get his hands on them, and how will they help in the war effort?
F-16s, used F-16s from several allies, NATO allies in Europe, could arrive in Ukraine within 4 or 5 months. Ukrainians can use those. The Ukrainian pilots are actually quite good, and they can use those in several different roles. One would be air-to-air or air defense. For example, an F-16 flying at a high altitude could see a low-flying Russian cruise missile, for example, attacking a Ukrainian city before a ground-based radar might be able to see it because of the curvature of the Earth. So some of those roles might be more easily performed sooner. The more challenging task for F-16 pilots is what is called close air support for ground operations. That requires a level of integration that may take more months, but could be more valuable for Ukrainian forces.
And one last question before we go. The world's atomic energy watchdog has warned both Ukraine and Russia not to undermine the safety of the nearby nuclear power plant that's in Zaporizhia, although it said that there was no immediate risk. But this incident would surely raise questions about the nuclear future of Europe, such as, the viability of nuclear energy in the region. What's your take?
It really shouldn't have much impact on the broader debate in Europe about nuclear power. The Zaporizhia plant has been run for a long time safely. The kind of reactor there, a more modern reactor called VVER, is much more safer than the Chernobyl type RBMK reactor that blew up in 1986. So the question about use of nuclear power will probably depend in Europe on larger considerations such as public attitudes toward nuclear power, the climate advantages of having zero emission electric generating capacity, and the cost of nuclear power. The Zaporizhia plant has been exporting electricity to Europe prior to the war, and that may continue after the war, assuming that Ukraine regains control.
Ambassador, we'll have to leave it there for now. Thank you very much for your time and your insight today. William Courtney, adjunct senior fellow at RAND Corporation and former U.S. ambassador to Georgia and Kazakhstan. And for more of our coverage on the Russia-Ukraine war, do head to our website, cna.asia, or our mobile app.